On March 31, 1903, an article appeared in The Sun which read,
Plans were filed yesterday for a new city home to be built for Mrs. Alice Drexel. The home will contain a private ballroom and 2 salons, in addition to a dining hall and a library.
This home was designed by the famous architect, Horace Trumbauer, at the behest of John Drexel as a gift for his wife, Alice. John was a partner in Drexel Morgan and Company, a bank that had been established in 1871 by his father, Anthony Drexel, in conjunction with John Morgan as his junior partner. Today we know this institution as J.P. Morgan and Chase Bank. The building cost $500,000, which in today's currency would have been over $18 million. While the house was being constructed, the Drexels were in England as the guests of King Edward and Queen Alexandria at a ball that was held in Windsor Castle. They also enjoyed a sumptuous luncheon with the royal couple while attending horse races at the Ascot. This sign of royal favor was a huge social coup for Mrs. Drexel and made her well respected in New York's high society. At East 62nd Street, Mr. Trumbauer built a 40-room French mansion. The house was 4 stories tall and included a basement. The exterior walls were covered with limestone from Indiana. It included Beaux Arts garlands and scrollwork frothing with an entrance that was centered below a 3rd-floor wrought iron balcony. Included within the mansion was a ballroom which could be accessed through an elevator. The rooms had 26-foot-tall ceilings, parquet floors, terraces, and views of Central Park. As with the wealthy families who have been featured in the HBO series, The Gilded Age, the Drexels summered in Newport, Rhode Island, where they stayed at Fairholme, their lavish mansion on Ochre Point. The term, Gilded Age, was coined by Mark Twain, and has been used by some historians to refer to the period between 1877 and 1900, which was a time of unparalleled and rapid economic growth in America, especially in the northern and western regions of the United States. During this time, people who had been merely rich now became fabulously wealthy. The Drexels were certainly no exception. Their friends included the Rockefellers, Vanderbilts, Carnegies, Astors, and Morgans, all of whom were titans in industry or finance. While John Drexel busied himself with work, his wife did what other wealthy women of that era did. She hosted lavish dinner parties and afternoon teas. She attended performances at the Metropolitan Opera House. She was also an active volunteer at the Social Service Department at the Volunteer Hospital, where her active interest in helping a 20-year-old amnesiac led to his recovery and repatriation with his family in New Haven, Connecticut. Sadly for Mrs. Drexel, her daughter had no interest in living a life that was filled with wealth and privilege. On June 5, 1919, Mrs. Drexel received word that her daughter had eloped to marry Captain William Barrett, a veteran pilot of the Army Air Service who had recently returned home after having served as a fighter pilot with the U.S. forces in France. This wedding made her a social laughingstock. The New York Tribune ran a headline that read,
Miss Alice Drexel wed an army man who was unknown to her parents.
The Tribune then went on to describe Captain Barrett in unflattering terms. He was described as being short and stocky with a shock of black hair. The paper wondered how the former pilot would be able to support his new wife given that he had been employed as a tutor prior to joining the Air Service some 18 months earlier. It also said that he had no background or experience with business. The Washington Herald referred to the wedding as a surprise to Newport, Washington, and New York society. Although Mrs. Drexel had wanted to host a lavish wedding when her daughter got married, Captain Barrett told the New York Tribune that
the suddenness and secrecy of the wedding was due to my wife's desire to avoid a formal ceremony.
The marriage only lasted a year. As it turned out, William Barrett was what was described at the time as a ne'er-do-well. Although his father was an Oregon state senator, William had been a constant disappointment to his father. He was expelled from the U.S. Naval Academy at Annapolis in 1911 for what was described as unbecoming conduct. In San Francisco, he visited a jewelry store and pretended to be wealthy. After paying the proprietor a $500 deposit for a $2,000 ring, he sold the ring to a pawnshop for $1,500. When he tried doing the same thing at another jewelry store, he was caught by the police before the theft could be completed. The judge threw out the case after alleging that no crime had been committed. The judge said that selling the ring to a pawnshop had been within his rights, particularly since he had not been behind in payments for the ring. As a result of this attempted crime, William Barrett became known as Diamond Bill. In 1919, following his return from France, he worked his way into the good graces of Miss Alice Drexel, the heiress of the John Drexel fortune. After convincing Alice to elope, they were married in New Rochelle. When Alice called her mother to tell her about the elopement, the couple were summoned to the family home in Manhattan. The conversation went from bad to worse. Alice was financially cut off by her parents. For a time, the couple traveled throughout Europe, staying in modest hotels and increasingly shabby apartments. In London, Diamond Bill met a former showgirl named Cydia Spreckles, whose wealthy husband had left her following a quarrel. All that Cydia had to show for her marriage was a pearl necklace that had been valued at $120,000. When Diamond Bill offered to take the necklace to be appraised and insured, the foolish young woman gave him the pearls. William Barrett subsequently abandoned his now pregnant wife and returned to the United States, leaving both Cydia and Alice in desperate straits. It was at this point that Alice contacted her parents for help. Her parents wired her the funds needed to book passage on a ship to return home. They welcomed her into their home and provided all of the medical care she would need. They also assisted her in getting a quiet divorce. Edwin Gerald William Barrett was born 9 months later in 1920. He died just 2 months short of his first birthday. It was all too much for the Drexels. Alice's marriage to William Barrett had made her mother the laughingstock of high society. As news about Diamond Bill's criminal past came to light, the Drexels boarded up their home and moved to Paris, France. As for Diamond Bill, after avoiding the police in Los Angeles where he had been trying to secure production rights to make a film, he fled to Brazil. In 1932, the Brazilian police arrested him for counterfeiting. A court sentenced him to a 6-year term in prison. The woman that Diamond Bill had stolen the necklace from married a Turkish prince and ended her days as an Anatolian princess. For a time, the former Mrs. Barrett lived in Manhattan. She eventually moved to England where she lived for the rest of her life. The magnificent house that had once been filled with laughter and music remained empty until 1929, when it was sold to a millionaire named James Blanchard Clews. Mr. Clews died in this house in December of 1934 after a long illness. In 1938, the house was converted into 9 spacious, upscale apartments. In time, one of the tenants would be Ernest Hemingway, who leased a 1-bedroom unit from the fall of 1959 to 1960. By the 1980s, the building had been converted to condominiums. The comedian Joan Rivers purchased the 5,190-square-foot penthouse in 1988. Joan subsequently brought in museum-trained restorers to strip away layers of paint from the French paneling. As Joan would later tell celebrity ghost stories, she hadn't believed in ghosts at the time she bought this property. She soon changed her mind. While visiting the property late one night, she immediately noticed 2 issues. One was that her Yorkshire Terrier had refused to enter the condominium. It sat outside the open doorway and whined. No amount of coaxing from Joan would entice her dog into crossing the threshold. While Joan thought that this was odd, she didn't think it was paranormal. Upon entering the unit, she did notice that it was extremely cold. Even though it was a warm and humid night, the apartment was chillingly cold. Much to her annoyance, she also found that someone had scribbled drawings and markings on the wall. It was all quite strange because the only people who should have had access to the apartment was Joan herself and the workman. When she took the elevator back downstairs, she told the elevator attendant that her apartment had been freezingly cold, that her dog had refused to enter the unit, and someone had scrawled graffiti all over one of the walls. The attendant completely floored her when he said,
"It sounds as though Mrs. Spencer is back."
According to the elevator attendant, Mrs. Spencer had been the niece of J.P. Morgan. She had lived in this building for many years and had died on the premises, in what was now the apartment of Joan Rivers. In the weeks to come, Joan became more and more uncomfortable with her apartment. The workmen did not like to stay late. The apartment was always cold no matter how high she turned the thermostat. If she carried her dog indoors, the dog would then scratch at the closed door in a desperate attempt to escape. Worst of all was the feeling that she just didn't belong in this apartment. She felt more and more like an unwelcome intruder who really just needed to leave. Sadly for Joan, she couldn't leave. She had sunk all of her money into this unit and had nowhere else to go. In desperation, she found a voodoo priestess in New Orleans who was willing to come to New York to help Joan Rivers by cleansing the apartment. Upon her arrival, the priestess told her that the ghost was very angry because she didn't like all of the changes that were being made. The woman did a lot of chanting while beating on her drum, and just like that, the ominous feeling was gone and the apartment started to warm up. When the voodoo practitioner asked if other residents in the building could benefit from her help, Joan took her to each apartment. Although it was past 2 in the morning, every single residence that Joan visited opened their doors to allow the voodoo priestess to do her exorcism. Everyone also had one or more stories to share with Joan. One woman who had thought about buying Joan's penthouse had gone upstairs for a look only to find a dance party in full swing. When she asked the realtor why there were people dancing in the penthouse, the realtor came over and the two went upstairs, only to find that nobody was there. Another woman said that as she left the building, she saw a very stylishly dressed couple coming down the stairs. When she asked the doorman who those posh people in the lobby were, the doorman didn't know what she was talking about because there was nobody there. Still another couple told about an antique chandelier that had once hung in the apartment. In addition to all of the sparkling crystals that had hung from this light had a lot of decorative porcelain cherubs. One night after this couple came home, they were shocked to find that the chandelier had been vandalized. Someone had smashed the heads off of each of the cherubs and the broken pieces lay scattered across their living room floor. For a time, after the cleansing ceremony, the apartment seemed normal. The workmen had finished their renovations. The unit was warm. Joan's dog had no problems with being in the apartment. Everything was as it should be until it suddenly wasn't. Just a few days later, the dog didn't want to be in the apartment. The temperature had again gotten chilly. The lights also had a disturbing tendency to not want to stay on. In desperation, Joan tried talking to the ghost. She told the ghost that she was a widow, and that she didn't have anywhere else to go. She begged Mrs. Spencer to leave her alone. A few days later, while Joan was in the basement, she found a framed picture that had been left against a wall under a pile of junk. When she looked at his picture, she felt a connection to it and thought that this might be Mrs. Spencer. After cleaning the dusty picture, she arranged to have it hung in the lobby. When she returned to her apartment, the menacing atmosphere had disappeared. The chill was gone. That night the phone rang. It was the voodoo priestess from New Orleans. The priestess told Joan that Mrs. Spencer was pleased that her picture was hanging in the lobby. Her one request from Joan was that freshly cut flowers be kept in a vase in the apartment. Joan was pleased to do this, and from that time on, she never had any problems. From time to time, she even said that the ghost of Mrs. Spencer would visit her. Whenever this happened, she would say good evening to the ghost and the spirit would smile and reply before vanishing from sight. In her interview with Celebrity Ghost Stories, she said that her relationship with Mrs. Spencer had changed. They were no longer adversaries. They were friends, and she said that she felt as though Mrs. Spencer had become a guardian who was looking after her. What's curious about this story is that as far as I can tell, J.P. Morgan did not have any niece with the last name of Spencer. While he did have a great-aunt named Sarah Spencer, she passed away in 1896. This would have been 19 years before the Drexel mansion had even been built. The portrait that Joan Rivers found does not look like Sarah Spencer Morgan. Her clothing is also noticeably more modern. I wonder if Mrs. Spencer was a tenant who was unrelated to the Morgan family. Joan Rivers died on September 4, 2014, at Mount Sinai Hospital at the age of 81. She had been hospitalized following a cardiac arrest. In 2015, a Saudi prince purchased the penthouse for $28 million. According to reports, he did not like her decorating style and planned to completely gut and renovate the apartment. Although nobody knows if he incurred the wrath of Mrs. Spencer, in 2022, the penthouse was listed for sale with an asking price of $38 million. In looking at the broker's online pictures, it does not appear as though the prince ever did anything to substantially change the ambience of this penthouse suite. So what do you think? Was the old Drexel mansion haunted, or did Joan Rivers imagine what had happened? If she imagined what had happened, why did the 8 other condominium owners in the building allow a voodoo priestess from New Orleans to conduct a cleansing ceremony in their homes? I wonder if Mrs. Spencer's picture still hangs in the lobby, and whether or not anyone has continued to provide freshly cut flowers to appease the spirit of this former resident. I also wonder if the ghost of Joan Rivers has joined Mrs. Spencer in defending their penthouse suite.
If you liked this video and would like to see more content, please click on the like and subscribe buttons.